Captain Ibrahim Traore, once dismissed as a mere figurehead in a region teetering on the edge of chaos, had just pulled off the unthinkable. While the world focused on the military standoff and diplomatic pressure mounting from General Langley of the United States, Traore was quietly orchestrating a plan that would send shockwaves through global power structures. In the shadows of Burkina Faso's border towns, a covert network was growing. Mercenaries, gold reserves, and a coalition of nations determined to break free from the grip of foreign powers. What everyone thought was silence from Traore. It was the calm before a storm that would reshape the future of the Sahel and the world. Captain Ibrahim Traore's silence was deafening. After months of political tension between Burkina Faso and the United States, particularly with AFRICOM under General Langley tightening its grip on the Sahel region, many believed Traore had folded. International media painted him as overwhelmed, isolated, and cornered by rising pressure from Western powers. Commentators speculated that his government was destabilizing and that he was losing influence both domestically and across neighboring states. But what the world didn't realize was that the silence wasn't fear. It was precision. Traore had gone quiet not to escape confrontation, but to buy time. Every delay, every canceled press appearance, every closed-door meeting was part of something larger, something few outside his inner circle could grasp. Washington interpreted Traore's quietness as a surrender of influence, a passive acknowledgement that Burkina Faso could not afford to go toe-to-toe with a global superpower. U.S. drones circled over the region, collecting data, watching for any sign of rebellion or instability. Military analysts looked for aggressive troop movements or public declarations of defiance, but they found nothing. It was a ghost field. The calm was almost suspicious, and in that calm, Washington relaxed its grip just slightly, thinking the threat had passed. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Traore's silence, logistics began to shift. Communication lines were rerouted, safe houses were activated, and old alliances were quietly reawakened. Intelligence operatives from neighboring countries reported unusual activity, but none of it was overtly hostile. It was subtle, precise, calculated. As the world waited for Traore to speak, he was already executing a plan that didn't need words. He was building something resilient, something unexpected. The people closest to the ground began to notice. First, drivers hired for unusual night shifts, trucks leaving government depots with unmarked cargo, and military uniforms that didn't match any known battalion. Yet, no official statement came. No press release explained what was happening. The only thing that grew louder was the international media frenzy, misreading Traore's silence as a symptom of weakness instead of a symptom of control. But the signs were there for anyone willing to look deeper. The truth was simple but dangerous. Traore wasn't retreating. He was preparing. As the world stared into silence, convinced it meant nothing, he was quietly positioning himself to make a move that would shake the global order. General Langley believed in leverage, military, economic, and diplomatic. From his command post, he viewed the Sahel as a region in flux, a chessboard of weak regimes, fractured alliances, and untapped potential. After months of diplomatic setbacks, he turned his focus directly on Burkina Faso. His message was clear: fall in line, or face isolation. U.S. forces ramped up surveillance flights over the region. American envoys circulated quietly among neighboring governments, and pressure mounted through economic channels. Aid packages were suddenly delayed, defense contracts reevaluated, and regional trade deals restructured in Washington's favor. Every lever of American influence began to move, slowly but forcefully, like a tightening vice. Langley's strategy wasn't just about controlling Burkina Faso, it was about setting an example. Other Sahel nations were watching closely. If Traore could defy the U.S. without consequence, it could inspire a wave of resistance. That risk was unacceptable, so Langley acted quickly and decisively. Joint military exercises were announced in neighboring Niger and Ghana, showcasing American firepower and operational reach. Western media, fed carefully crafted narratives, amplified the idea that Burkina Faso was drifting into instability under Traore's leadership. Internally, Memos were circulated warning of possible coups or foreign interference. The atmosphere was tense, but Washington felt confident that its dominance in the region would prevail. However, the general failed to see the shifting sands beneath his boots. His attention was fixed on direct confrontation, on speeches, parades, and troop deployments. But Traore wasn't playing the same game. The pressure being applied only served to drive him deeper into secrecy, forcing him to consolidate his plans with even greater caution. While Langley sent signals meant to intimidate, Traore interpreted them as validation. The Americans were nervous. Every new drone in the sky and every cut to foreign aid confirmed that his silence was working. The more Langley pushed, the more allies he quietly lost. Sahel leaders, weary of foreign interference, began to question their alignments. Intelligence. Reports from Chad and Mali suggested increased private communications with Burkina Faso. Some military officers in these countries admired Traore's defiance, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Slowly, and almost invisibly, the region began to shift. Washington believed it was isolating Traore, but it was doing the opposite, turning him into a symbol. And while the general moved pieces on a board he thought he controlled, Traore was carving out a new one entirely, just beyond his field of vision. Far from the capital of Ouagadougou, beyond the reach of international headlines and satellite scrutiny, a small border town near Mali began to stir. It was the kind of place rarely mentioned in reports or policy briefings, a dusty crossroads with a few scattered buildings, a half-paved road, and a radio station that barely reached the next village. But something had changed. Over a period of several weeks, people noticed strange activity. Trucks began arriving at odd hours, always traveling in convoys, their contents hidden under heavy tarps. Construction crews worked through the night, building what looked like military infrastructure. But without any official markings, local residents were paid handsomely to stay quiet, or were moved out entirely. Small hotels, usually empty, filled with men who didn't speak local dialects and kept to themselves. At first, villagers assumed it was just another army exercise or a temporary operation, but then fences were erected, satellite dishes were installed, and the road leading in was blocked by makeshift checkpoints. No announcements were made, no military insignias were displayed. Whatever was happening, it was not meant to be seen. By the time outside observers took notice, it was already too late to decipher the full picture. Aerial surveillance showed warehouses being completed within days. Analysts flagged the unusual speed of development, but they lacked context. The project wasn't on any public budget, and no construction permits had been filed. This wasn't part of Burkina Faso's official military strategy. It was something else entirely. Something personal, driven by Traore himself. Inside those warehouses, a covert operation was taking shape. Satellite jammers, encrypted communication hubs, and armored vehicles were being stockpiled. The town was becoming a fortress, not for battle, but for coordination. This was the nerve center of Traore's response. Away from the noise of the capital and far from the eyes of foreign diplomats, his team could move without interference. Mercenaries began arriving in small groups, disguised as aid workers or logistics personnel. Their weapons were delivered in separate parts, smuggled across 3 borders, reassembled in silence. The location wasn't chosen by chance. Its isolation made it invisible to global intelligence, but its proximity to Mali and Niger gave it strategic reach. From here, Traore could extend his influence while staying in the shadows, and with each passing day, the town transformed from a forgotten outpost into the secret heart of an operation designed to change everything. The movement of gold was the first real clue that something unusual was happening. Burkina Faso's national reserves, stored in high-security vaults under the central bank, had always been treated as untouchable, monitored, guarded, and regulated by both local officials and international partners. The gold served as the country's financial backbone. Yet one weekend, without warning or media coverage, the reserves began to vanish, not all at once and not with force. They disappeared methodically, like pieces in a game only one side understood. The transfers were hidden beneath layers of deception. Official records showed humanitarian shipments leaving the capital, destined for aid camps in the north. But When satellite images were reviewed weeks later, analysts realized the cargo didn't match the typical weight of medical supplies or food. Convoys moved at night, using secondary roads. Drivers carried no identification. The vehicles bore no government logos, and none of the usual checkpoints flagged them, because they had been ordered not to. By Monday morning, a quiet panic set in among insiders. Treasury officials who were not part of Traore's inner circle discovered massive gaps in inventory. But before they could raise alarms, they were reassigned or silenced with abrupt retirements and transfers. A few brave voices tried to leak the story to the press, but without proof, it sounded like rumor. Meanwhile, the gold kept moving, out of the city, into the desert and toward the unknown. Eventually, the truth surfaced. The gold wasn't missing. It had been exchanged. Traore had orchestrated a silent, high-stakes trade with foreign intermediaries, bartering raw gold for untraceable security assets, weapons, satellite systems, encrypted communication gear, and mercenary contracts. No paperwork was filed. No receipts existed. It was an economy outside the system, powered by resources that were supposed to be locked in national vaults. The brilliance of the operation was in its timing. While the world assumed Traore was weak and isolated, he was liquidating assets and converting them into power. Power that didn't rely on Western banks, international loans, or diplomatic approval. The gold, once a symbol of national wealth, controlled by foreign interests, had become the fuel for a new kind of sovereignty. By the time international financial monitors noticed the irregularities, the gold was long gone. It had changed hands in deserts and airstrips, in deals signed behind barbed wire fences and guarded by men with no flags. And with it, Traore had purchased the one thing he needed most: independence on his own terms. As the gold reserves slipped quietly away, a more troubling sign began to emerge: mercenaries. Initially, they were easy to dismiss as rumors or isolated incidents. But as weeks passed, reports began to converge from different corners of the region. Armed men, well-equipped, highly trained and carrying no national insignia, were seen moving through Burkina Faso and its neighboring countries. They weren't rebels, they weren't terrorists, and they certainly weren't part of any recognized military. These were professionals, mercenaries, hired to protect something valuable, or perhaps to carry out something far more calculated. It didn't take long for local intelligence to connect the dots. These mercenaries were linked to Traore's operation, though he had done everything in his power to keep their involvement murky. The mercenaries didn't operate under the typical chains of command seen in state-run armies. Instead, they appeared to answer only to shadowy figures, or perhaps to a network of regional contacts, an underground economy of security providers that had long been nurtured in the Sahel's fractured political landscape. There were no headlines blaring about their arrival, no press conferences to announce their purpose. They simply appeared in the background, blending into the local environment, but with a quiet air of menace. Armed with advanced weaponry and high-end surveillance tools, these men didn't seem interested in controlling territory. They weren't there to wage a conventional war. Instead, their role seemed more like a protective force, guarding valuable assets, both physical and strategic, that no one was supposed to know about. The situation took a more dangerous turn when local authorities in neighboring Mali and Niger reported an influx of these same mercenaries crossing borders. They appeared to be part of a larger, fluid operation, a coalition not just of foreign fighters, but of expertise, logistics, and resources that were flowing untraceably from one place to another. No longer confined to the quiet border town, the mercenaries were now scattered across the region, working in teams, securing sensitive locations, and ensuring that whatever Traore was planning, it had a perimeter of defense. These mercenaries were not the usual actors in the Sahel, who typically worked in smaller, disorganized groups. They were well coordinated with clear objectives, and perhaps most disturbing of all, they had the ear of powerful people. They operated like a private army, an invisible one, with loyalty tied not to a government, but to a figure whose ambitions stretched far beyond the control of any single nation. This quiet, almost unseen force was the backbone of Traore's strategy. While the world focused on his silence and misread his intentions, he was assembling a network of firepower and expertise that could not only defend his position, but would eventually strike when the time was right. What started as a few hired hands in remote villages had grown into a full-scale shadow army, prepared to back whatever moves he was about to make. The mercenaries were his eyes, ears, and muscle, and they were everywhere, waiting for their moment to make an impact. As the mercenaries moved like ghosts through the Sahel, a more visible shift began to take place. Foreign embassies in Burkina Faso started closing their doors. The first to act was the French embassy, quietly announcing a reduction in staff, citing security concerns. Few thought much of it at the time. France had been involved in the region for years, particularly in its former colonies, and tensions had been simmering for months over the increasing independence of countries like Burkina Faso. But what followed would turn a diplomatic ripple into a full-blown diplomatic exodus. Within days, Canada and Germany followed suit, with their embassies issuing similar statements about adjusting staffing levels and reassessing security. These were subtle moves, yet they carried weight in the geopolitical theater. While the public was distracted by stories of poverty and insurgency in the region, behind the scenes, something much larger was unfolding. The closures were not simply a response to safety concerns. They were a sign that Burkina Faso had become a place where foreign powers no longer felt secure in their influence. As the months passed, the exodus accelerated. The American embassy, long considered the nerve center for U.S. diplomatic efforts in the region, closed without fanfare. Staff were evacuated, leaving behind only a skeleton crew, and that too would soon follow. The embassy compound, a symbol of Washington's presence in West Africa, stood empty. The official reason? A broad statement about the changing political and security landscape in the Sahel. But those in the know understood the real reason. It was no longer safe to maintain a stronghold in Burkina Faso. The silence surrounding these closures was deafening. Each country's withdrawal was framed as a precautionary measure, a move, driven by intelligence reports suggesting an escalating threat. But the pattern was unmistakable. The embassies weren't just leaving for their own safety. They were leaving because they could no longer guarantee control or influence in the region. The power dynamics were shifting, and the ground was becoming unstable beneath their feet. It wasn't just the embassies that were retreating. The diplomatic community itself began to shrink. Foreign aid workers, diplomats, and contractors who once flooded into the country now slowly trickled out, avoiding the increasingly hostile atmosphere. For years, the Sahel had been a zone of foreign intervention, with Western nations heavily invested in both security operations and development projects. But as the embassies packed up, the reality set in. Burkina Faso, under Traore's leadership, had become a geopolitical island, a place where external influence had been effectively neutralized. This sudden diplomatic vacuum, however, was not a cause for panic among the locals. If anything, it confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. Traore's vision was gaining traction. The Sahel was no longer a Western playground for military bases and economic dominance. It was becoming an independent sphere of influence, one where foreign powers were no longer welcome to dictate the terms of engagement. What had begun as a quiet strategic maneuver had now escalated into an undeniable shift in regional power. Burkina Faso's closed embassies were not just buildings being emptied. They were a metaphor for an entire order collapsing, piece by piece. Weeks of silence finally ended with a moment of calculated brilliance. A video released by Burkina Faso's state media, a rare and carefully crafted message from Captain Ibrahim Traore himself. There was no grand ceremony, no dramatic speech. The video was simple, just Traore standing in front of a large unadorned map of West Africa. The frame was sparse, and the setting was intentionally humble, almost anonymous. But the message he conveyed would resonate across borders, through corridors of power, and into the hearts of those who had underestimated him. Traore didn't directly address the escalating military pressure from Washington or the diplomatic fallout from Europe. Instead, he spoke about something larger, an idea that no one in the international community had seen coming. His words were clear and purposeful, outlining a new vision for the Sahel, one that was independent of foreign control, free from the entanglements of Western interests, and rooted firmly in African sovereignty. He spoke not just of Burkina Faso, but of a new coalition of Sahelian nations, an alliance formed out of necessity, but one that could no longer tolerate the influence of former colonial powers. In the background of his message was the map, where he traced the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and other regional states. Traore spoke of a new order in the Sahel, one that would be built on the resources of the land, the will of its people, and the security of its leadership. He didn't say much about the specifics of this new alliance. No names were mentioned, no formal agreements acknowledged. But the implications were clear. Burkina Faso was no longer a pawn in the game of great powers. It was positioning itself as the heart of a movement that could challenge the Western-dominated systems of trade, security, and diplomacy. But it wasn't just his words that carried weight. The video was carefully timed, released when the world was at its most vulnerable. International markets were already on edge, with instability in the region affecting oil prices, gold markets, and foreign investment. Governments, already distracted by their own internal crises, struggled to process the full meaning of Traore's message. In a sense, the world wasn't ready for what he said, because it didn't fit into the narrative that had been constructed about him. They had expected him to either crumble under pressure or make an overt move toward war. Instead, he had calmly placed a central figure in a regional shift that no one had anticipated. As the world processed Captain Ibrahim Traore's chilling message, the true depth of his strategy began to unravel. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. The response, seemingly aimed at General Langley and Washington's increasing pressure, was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Investigations into the weeks leading up to Traore's video message revealed a complex network of alliances and covert operations stretching far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Intelligence agencies, both local and international, scrambled to piece together the truth. And what they discovered would send shockwaves through capitals across the globe. A clandestine coalition had been forming quietly for months, its existence almost completely under the radar. Traore, along with a handful of other key figures from across the Sahel, had been quietly meeting in secret locations, discussing the future of the region without Western interference. Burkina Faso had emerged as the unlikely epicenter of this new alliance, and Traore had taken on the role of its unspoken leader. But this was no simple political movement. It was a complex web of financial, military, and intelligence connections that spanned the globe. What surprised many analysts was the involvement of financial entities that were considered too niche or too obscure to be of concern. Buried deep within the financial transactions were patterns that suggested an underground network of rogue bankers and former intelligence operatives, many with ties to the global south. These figures weren't acting on behalf of any government. They were lone actors, working together to create a parallel system of finance, one that operated outside the control of Western banks and international institutions. The gold was just the beginning. It was the currency used to fund this new order, but the real prize was a new economic system that didn't rely on the dollar. The movement's reach extended far beyond Burkina Faso, with growing support from countries like Mali, Niger, and even parts of Mauritania. While these nations had long been fragmented by internal strife, Traore's message had unified them in a way that hadn't been seen in decades. The alliances were practical, born out of necessity. They were economic, military, and strategic, all united by a common goal: to reduce their dependency on Western powers, whose influence had been seen as both exploitative and destabilizing. And while Western diplomats, business leaders, and intelligence officers scrambled to make sense of the situation, the Sahel nations were already moving ahead, building the framework for a new power bloc. The connection to foreign mercenaries who had once seemed like mere hired guns began to make sense. These men, far from being outsiders, were part of a larger logistical chain. They were serving as protectors of this emerging network, ensuring that the flow of resources remained uninterrupted. They weren't just securing gold or military supplies. They were ensuring that the trade of influence, currency, and power could proceed undisturbed. They were the silent enforcers of the new regional order. The most disturbing discovery, however, was the extent to which the U.S. had underestimated the depth of this regional shift. What began as a series of minor diplomatic miscalculations had now snowballed into a far-reaching movement that could not be easily contained. As Washington and its allies tried to stabilize their interests in the region, Traore and his growing coalition were already laying the foundations of a new parallel power structure, one that could operate without their approval or even knowledge. By the time the full scope of this covert network was understood, it was too late. The wheels had already been set in motion, and the region had slipped further from Western control. Traore's response had been much more than a mere rebuttal to Langley. It had been the unveiling of a new geopolitical reality, one in which the Sahel was no longer just a pawn in global politics. It was emerging as a key player in a game no one had seen coming. And now the world had no choice but to watch as this new power block began to take shape. As the dust settled from Traore's bold announcement and the shadowy network he had constructed came into sharper focus, the international response was nothing short of chaotic. Governments around the world, particularly in Washington and Brussels, were scrambling to recalibrate their strategies. The intelligence community, which had once seen the Sahel as a manageable hotspot, now found itself facing a new geopolitical reality. The growing coalition of Sahelian nations wasn't just a defiant group of rogue states. It had evolved into a sophisticated and well-coordinated bloc, one that could no longer be ignored. The initial reaction from Washington was a mixture of confusion and frustration. General Langley, who had expected to either see Traore bow under pressure or retreat into silence, found himself confronted with a challenge he hadn't anticipated. An organized, determined counterforce that wasn't interested in negotiations, but in rewriting the rules of the game entirely. U.S. diplomats immediately began lobbying for economic sanctions, but these measures had little effect on a region now armed with resources and a growing network of alternative trade routes. The Sahel nations, led by Burkina Faso, had no need to rely on Western institutions or banks anymore. With gold, strategic alliances, and mercenary protection, they had created an independent economy that could function on its own. Meanwhile, the European Union, still grappling with its post-Brexit identity and internal struggles, found itself equally sidelined. European diplomats, once the primary players in the region, were now faced with a harsh reality. Their historical influence was rapidly diminishing. France, in particular, struggled to regain control of the narrative. Its deep ties to former colonies like Mali and Burkina Faso were being rapidly replaced with Traore's vision of a new, African-driven political and economic order. French officials tried to salvage what they could through back-channel diplomacy, but the realization was dawning that their role in the region was now secondary, if not obsolete. On the ground, local governments that had once been dependent on foreign aid began to feel the winds of change. Formerly isolated leaders, wary of the growing power of this new coalition, started to realign themselves. Countries like Niger, Chad, and even Mauritania found themselves gravitating toward Burkina Faso's growing influence. They were drawn to the promise of a region where decisions would be made locally, without the interference of distant powers. The idea of sovereignty, long undermined by foreign military bases and aid dependency, was now within their reach. However, not everyone embraced Traore's vision. Despite the unity growing among Sahelian nations, internal opposition began to simmer in certain quarters. Political factions, military leaders, and civilian activists, skeptical of Traore's approach, voiced their concerns. Some questioned the wisdom of tying their future so closely to a leader whose methods, though effective, were still shrouded in secrecy. There were fears that the growing alliance might centralize power too much in the hands of one man, undermining the very ideals of regional cooperation and autonomy that it promised to promote. Yet, despite these undercurrents of dissent, the momentum for Traore's coalition only seemed to grow stronger, fueled by the fear and uncertainty spreading through Washington and European capitals. Back in the quiet border towns, however, where the seeds of this new order had first been sown, the coalition's foundations were firming up. The mercenaries remained stationed, and the infrastructure of secrecy continued to grow. Traore's inner circle was slowly evolving into something resembling a shadow government, and the movement's leadership began to coalesce around a set of guiding principles that were now far removed from the ideals of the West. Traore had not just pushed back against foreign influence, he had redefined the rules of global engagement, showing that the Sahel could be a place where its leaders controlled their own destiny, free from the chains of past colonial powers. As Washington and its allies struggled to regain the initiative, it was clear that a new era was dawning in the Sahel. A region that had long been seen as an afterthought in the world's power struggles was now at the center of an unfolding geopolitical drama. And as the story of Traore's rise spread, it was evident that the world would never view the Sahel, or Africa, the same way again. The balance of power had shifted. As the weeks stretched into months, it became evident that the power shift in the Sahel was no temporary upheaval. What began as an isolated maneuver by Captain Ibrahim Traore had now evolved into a full-scale geopolitical realignment, one that would reverberate for years to come. The moves he had set in motion, from the covert military alliances to the silent draining of gold reserves, had successfully changed the course of history in the region. But as the world tried to make sense of the situation, the question remained: what would the long-term consequences be for Africa and the rest of the world? Traore, now regarded as both a hero and a villain in different quarters, had achieved something few thought possible. He had united a fractured region and created a power bloc that functioned entirely outside the structures of Western-dominated international politics. His coalition of Sahelian nations, once disparate and internally divided, had found solidarity in the face of external pressure. As the diplomatic void left by foreign embassies continued to widen, Traore's influence over his neighbors only deepened. Burkina Faso was no longer just the central figure in this movement. It had become the nerve center for a larger, continent-wide call for independence and self-determination. In Africa, many saw Traore as a symbol of resistance against neo-imperialism. Countries that had long struggled with political instability and economic dependency on the West began to look to his coalition as a model for self-sufficiency. Though the process was not without its challenges, the economic and military cooperation between Sahelian states began to solidify. It wasn't just about gold or strategic assets. It was about creating a new narrative for the continent. Trade. Routes that bypassed Western ports were established, and new financial systems, free from the control of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, emerged, driven by African resources, African labor, and African leadership. But the shift wasn't universally welcomed. Outside the Sahel, there were growing fears of instability. Washington, in particular, found itself struggling to maintain influence over a region that had been a key part of its anti-terrorism strategies and resource extraction networks. While military action was briefly considered, the realization soon, set in that direct confrontation with this newly formed bloc, could spiral into something far more dangerous. The power Traore had built wasn't just about military strength. It was about the resources he controlled and the growing number of nations rallying behind him. For now, the West's response was cautious, but it was clear that this was no passing phase. With every passing day, Traore's influence expanded beyond the Sahel, reaching into the corridors of international institutions and reshaping global economic ties. The US and European powers, once the undisputed leaders of the global order, now found themselves in a delicate dance, trying to balance their interests in Africa with the new reality on the ground. In the quiet corners of the Sahel, the changes were far more palpable. Small towns and border villages that had once been overlooked were now central to the flow of goods, people, and influence. The mercenaries who had initially been seen as hired hands had become enforcers of a new order, their presence a constant reminder that the region was now under the control of a powerful, unseen force. Leaders within Traore's circle were emerging from the shadows, their influence growing as the coalition took on more formalized structures. But despite the apparent success, questions lingered. Could the alliance hold together in the long run? Would the promises of self-determination give way to the same political struggles and power grabs that had plagued the region before? As Traore's coalition expanded, so too did the risks of internal divisions. And even as the world watched, captivated by the unfolding drama, one thing was clear. Captain Ibrahim Traore had set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of history, not just for the Sahel, but for the global balance of power. The story was far from over, and its final chapters had yet to be written.